Do you want to be my slide operator? My clicker? Okay. Hello, how's everyone doing? Awesome. I like awesome. So like I said before, I am one of a team of 2 therapists that works on our Help for Heroes unit. And so we work with active duty, veterans, and first responders. First responders including police, EMT, firefighters, and we would even loop like sheriff's deputies that work within the jail system in there too. And so I think it's a great topic to talk about trauma with them because trauma is so pervasive in all the other mental health things, especially with substance use disorders and other addictions. So I'm going to kind of loop that in a little bit later, but I think, I don't know very many people who have had problems with substance or other addiction that don't also have some sort of trauma in their background. Go ahead. So I think probably the most important thing to consider when you're working with military and first responders is to understand the culture. It's different. And so here's just like I have a cheat sheet like this by my desk because I am not military or first responder. My co-therapist is, so he has a little bit better time with this. But so it's important when you're talking to command. We do a lot of communication work with command and with the members themselves. So kind of knowing who is what class they are, understanding how the officers and enlisted, the kind of hierarchy there is super important. You can find tutorials pretty easily on the internet. So like if you Google mental health therapy and military culture, several will come up. The VA's got a really good one. But the other things to consider with culture are understanding what branch of the military they are and the nuances within that. For example, when we're working with the Air Force, they're more lenient. Like if we're working with someone and we need some extra time, they're very willing to give more time. Whereas the Army, they're going to give you 2 weeks, and they're picking them up in 2 weeks, especially with active duty. So just understanding that there's nuances within the military. And the other thing is, to know we're in an area where there's a lot of military around us. And for you to understand, have a general understanding of what happens at what base. So for example, Buckley is an Air Force base, but they have all branches there. So it's not uncommon to get someone from Buckley who is Navy instead of Air Force. And then having an understanding that at Buckley, they're probably more than likely going to be doing something with space, with satellites. So that's kind of what they do there. Whereas if they're coming from F.E. Warren in Wyoming, they're doing something with nuclear weapons. So that's helpful just to kind of have that, to gain that knowledge so you can at least talk a little bit intelligently on their behalf. Go ahead. So I just have some statistics here, and I think it's important to note. It's estimated that 30% of first responders develop behavioral health conditions, including but not limited to depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, as compared to 20% in the general population. In a study about suicidality, firefighters were reported to have higher attempt and ideation rates than the general population. In law enforcement, the estimates suggest between 125 and 300 police officers commit suicide every year. So I'm going to say that's on the low end considerably. I would say 80% of the first responders that we have had on our unit know someone directly who has committed suicide. So that's pretty hard to know. And then moving over to the military side, 1 in 4 active duty members show signs of mental health condition. PTSD in the military is 15 times higher than civilians. And in 2015, 30% of active duty service members were binge drinkers. Just over 1/3, that's quite a bit, engaged in hazardous drinking orders that could meet criteria for alcohol use disorder. So some pretty significant mental health substance things in there. And another thing of note, sexual assault is still really prevalent. So it's actually gone up 40% for females across all branches since 2016. And so it has been inconsistent as far as this report goes. It's been consistent among males, but that's because males don't report. So it's happening. Not at the rates that it is happening for females, but it's happening. So we often have, when we have females on our unit, probably 90% of the time there's been a sexual assault or harassment in there.
Would you like questions during your presentation or after?
During's fine.
So with the 40% since 2016, do you see that may be a correlation with the Me Too movement where women are actually being empowered to go ahead and talk?
Yes, I do. I do think that there's always been underreporting, especially when we have working with women who were active duty 20 years ago and they come to our unit and they have never said a word because they knew that if they said a word about it, their careers would be over, they'd be further ridiculed and shunned. So I think that has a lot to do with that. We're actually seeing some actual numbers now where it was heavily underreported before.
Along with that, are you seeing an increase with women, so women sheriffs or women police officers that are now starting to report sexual assault in their job or sexual harassment? Again, there's so many.
Yeah, so we haven't had a large population of women first responders, and of those we've had, I haven't seen the statistics like that like I have with the military, at least not yet. But I think a lot of that reason is because my sample size is not as large. Yeah. So probably the biggest thing to understand in the culture of the military is stigma. These are the reasons why people don't get help. These are the reasons why the suicide rates are so high. So we'll start with self-stigma. So this, is it goes for both first responders and military. So these are things people actually have said to me. So if I go get help, I will let my brothers and sisters in arms down. My unit will no longer trust me. I've heard this from police officers as well. I will be seen as weak. I should be able to handle myself. What will my family think? Because these are, these strong men and women who have these power positions, and they're supposed to be able to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders. What's wrong with me that I need help? I'm ashamed I can't do this on my own. And the flip side of that is the organization stigma, which is equally as bad. So again, this goes for both first responders and military. So place on leave, not for fit for duty. So I see this a lot with even firefighters and police officers. If they come and let us know that they're having suicidal thoughts, they will immediately get put on not fit for duty. And so that can mean a few different things. That can mean you have to go through X amount of therapy before you can even be evaluated for fitness of duty. And sometimes that can be months. On the military side, demotion or loss of rank. Again, the branches are different. Navy and Air Force tend to work with the member a little better. Army, not as much. And a lot of times, unfortunately, we see separation from the military. So we'll have people come to us as their last military stop before separation, which is really sad and unfortunate in a lot of cases. Some of the reasons are because they had a mental health condition that they did not report prior to getting in the military, and that will be almost certain terms for separation. They lied on their application and they ended up having schizophrenia or bipolar, or those are kind of the two things that the military will not work with. Insufficient benefit to first responders. This is so frustrating. When you have someone that's really struggling and they really need to be impatient, and the insurance company say, "I'll give you 4 days." Like, great. And then the other part is no confidentiality, because when you have in the military or first responder and you have a mental health condition, everyone knows about it because they have to. So I think the other thing that is very important to note about treating trauma with these populations is understanding that 90% of the time, they also have had some sort of significant trauma or neglect in their childhood or adolescence. Every time. I can't think of one. I'm sure there are some, but pretty much all of them have something in their background. So child abuse and neglect can impact combat first responder PTSD. And so this is from a study, Owens in 2018. And so they even showed that individuals with low combat exposure but high childhood trauma had greater PTSD severity. So think about that. And then untreated PTSD in the military and first responder parents may pass trauma onto their children. So if you think about trauma being a generational issue, if it's not treated with one generation, the impacts of that parent who is impacted is, having that kind of impact on their child. When you think about, often in the military, that you have generations of people who serve. Same thing with firemen or policemen. Sorry about that, guys. Go ahead. All right, so we look at treating the whole person at Denver Springs. So we have actually several treatment tracks on the Help for Healers unit. We have the trauma, combat and pre-combat, addiction, and mental wellness. But oftentimes, we're doing 2 tracks simultaneously. So someone will be often in the addiction track and the trauma track. Some people are in the addiction, trauma, and mental wellness. So we really can manage the needs of each individual depending on what they're facing. I'm going to pass these around so you guys can take a look at them. But yeah, it's like, so this is our addictions book. I don't love this one. It's heavily weighted with 12-step. There's good parts of it. There's not great parts of it. These are not the only thing we use. We also just supplement with what we think the patient needs and what will be helpful to them. The mental health one is largely schema-based, which we use a lot. We'll talk about that a little further. And then the trauma one is primarily CPT, cognitive processing therapy. So go ahead and pass it around. We can take a look at those. Thanks. Yeah.
So thinking about the stigma of the slide before, are you finding that there are people, it's socially acceptable to come in under an addiction versus saying, hey, I'm having a trauma crisis or I'm having a mental health crisis?
That often happens.
So that's what do you find that again, this is such a weird way to put it, that it is acceptable that the clients and patients are able to kind of keep their dignity to go back to their position if they say, hey, I've got some addiction problem.
Yeah.
And how is that looked at?
So how do we manage it from our end?
Yes.
So we will treat everyone with trauma, and we will assess everyone for trauma, I should say that instead. And one way we do that is through schemas. So all patients that come into our unit are given the Young Schema Questionnaire. And it is a 232 bunch statements. They're not questions, they're statements. And then you answer 1 through 6 on a Likert scale, which most appropriately responds to how you feel about the statement. And then we score the schemas. So this is I'm not going to pass this one around, but this is an example of what it looks scored. And what I want to just point out is that most of the time, like almost all people on this unit score very high in self-sacrifice and unrelenting standards. They also score very high in emotional deprivation, abandonment, and mistrust and abuse. So those schemas seem to marry each other, which really backs up the data that I just mentioned from the study, that the childhood trauma and the combat trauma often go hand in hand. So this having this here lets us have a conversation about why you scored high in this schema. And then in the green book, there's blurbs about what each schema, description of each schema. And so in those schemas, they can read it and go, oh, I really relate to that. And that opens a larger discussion about how they got to that schema. So we explain that, schemas are formed out of the way we grew up, the environment in which we were raised, our parents' viewpoints, our socioeconomic standards, and a number of different things. And when you phrase it that way, it doesn't feel so shameful. And they understand that these thought processes and behaviors came from somewhere, which is really helpful for them to move forward to want to address them. It takes the blame, the shame out of it. Yeah, so patients report understanding schemas and how they form helps them feel less defective. So the next thing we do, so the schemas is the first thing we do. And when we go through the schemas, we will begin to identify some traumas. The next thing we have them do is start the cognitive processing therapy. So then the first part of that is a trauma inventory, which sheds usually a lot of light, where we ask them to write down anything that they can remember from birth to present, including physical or emotional trauma. So it could be 8 years old, broke my leg, fell out a tree. Just like very simple statements. From that, we will look at the more significant ones and sit down with them, and then we will work on those using the CPT process. And that's the trauma statements. They present the trauma statements both with a therapist, and then they present them to the group. And in doing this kind of method, they are being able to be vulnerable. And remember, these are military and first responders who have very difficulty being vulnerable. And but they also understand that they can share this and shed shame, because the group in which they're sharing it is providing them with empathy. And then the other piece of that is when they're working on the CPT, it doesn't matter if they've just started or their second or third trauma. They're working on them in the milieu, often at night when they're assigned homework. And that understanding, like, well, your trauma is different than mine, but it's kind of the same and we're both being exposed, really helps bring the cohort together. The final piece in the way we deal with trauma is after they've completed the CPT process on a specific trauma, we will address it with some kind of exposure therapy. I do somatic experiencing, which we'll talk a little bit more about, but EMDR, direct exposure to smells or sounds, also effective. It just depends a little bit on the strength of the therapist. So for an example of this one, we had a gentleman that worked in the morgue in Afghanistan. And so he smelled a lot of burning flesh. And he couldn't even go to a barbecue or be out in his neighborhood in the summertime because he was so triggered by that smell. And so we were able to have the kitchen burn some meat, and we did the scent exposure therapy with him. So again, very tailored to whatever they need to do. Just a little bit about somatic experiencing. So Peter Levine, a lot of you guys have probably heard of him, is the creator. And he observed animals in the wild, and he noticed that after a traumatic event, like when a gazelle is getting chased by a lion, it's panicky, it's flight, fight, freeze, but then when it's over, you see it going to the side of the pond, and it shakes a little bit and kind of dispels that. So it's worked through the whole process. With us, a lot of times, especially with complex trauma, we never get a chance to dispel that. And so what happens is we get stuck points, and that's that PTSD snapshot of different things that keeps rolling around your head. And so somatic experiencing is a way for people to bring their trauma memory together with all of their senses. So senses are very important. So when we're in the trauma memory, I'm like, what do you smell? What do you hear? What's the temperature? How do you feel in your body? All of those are very important part of it. I think we'll be okay in time. So I do have a clip of me doing a short part of somatic experiencing with a patient. This patient is not from this state. I do have permission for you to use this for teaching tools. So let's go ahead and do that one. So somatic experiencing in many ways has parts that are, maybe get back up a little bit, parts that are very similar to EMDR is that you often start and end with a resourcing or safe place memory. So this one, for the sake of time, this is a 40-minute session, and I'm not going to do all that, but I have like 6 minutes here. And so this particular woman had significant sexual abuse from her father. And at this, so we have already done the resourcing memory at the beginning of it, and we're going to go in here, and I'll explain a little bit more about it at the end. So go ahead. Oh, I can't hear it very well. Is there any way we can make it louder? Sorry. Yeah, you know what? We can't hear it. Sorry about that, guys.
We have some portable speakers.
Do you?
Maybe videos. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that stinks.
These things aren't good.
I know.
Would you go back and explain that again, just really quickly?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So this is
the
what.
correlation of it. What do you find?
So so people in this unit almost always have very high or high in self-sacrifice, which makes sense, first responders, military, and also unrelenting standards, military.
Yes.
But they also often score high in these top three: abuse and mistrust, emotional deprivation, and abandonment.
Just because I know I'm in the training center, TK center.
Yeah.
And so we have a lot of military people that are also pilots, and they have a lot of OCPD.
Yeah.
Not OCD, but
Yeah.
OCPD, which most people don't get, but
Yeah.
it's definitely that.
Yeah. 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 Okay, I guess that's not going to work, but sorry for the delay there. No, it's cute.
I got you. It's hard to find stuff.
So the idea of the somatic experiencing is that as you're processing through it, to bring in all the senses, and really you do want to be aroused like every emotion that you might experience during the trauma. Another key part that I do is that once we've processed through the trauma, we go to like the point of where the traumatic event happened. So for this woman on the video, she was explaining that her dad came into her room and they were wrestling, and then he threw her on her bed, and it was after that that he started to molest her. And what happens so much with trauma is people go back in their brains and think, I should have done this. I wish I would have said this. I wish I would have behaved this way. So after we process it once, I go back to that point and I ask the person, if there was anything you could or wanted to do or say, what would it have been? It doesn't matter that you're a kid and he's an adult. None of that matters. What would you have done? And she said, I wanted to run. And so I said, run. So while they're in the visualization, I'm like, tell me how you get away from his grip. And she tells me that she struggles and she slips free. And I'm like, and then what did you want to do? And she was like, I just wanted to run. I'm like, run. Tell me what it's like. Describe what it's like when you go out the house. And she's telling me what it's like. I'm like, where do you run to? And she said, I run out the door. I'm like, and then where? And then she had a friend's house who later became her husband as an adult that lived down the street. I ran to his house, and I'm like, great. Do you feel safe? She said, yes. And so when I get to the point, if someone can tell me that they feel safe, that's when the sessions, that's when we go back to the calm memory and end it. So that's a little bit about it. Sorry I didn't have the video, didn't quite work, so. So just to kind of summarize it, the trauma processing is really a multi-pronged processing between understanding the schemas that bed it, the CBT work, and then the exposure work, depending on which therapist is doing which exposure. The other thing that we really believe strongly in is that it's a whole body recovery. And so we do tons of mindfulness yoga, and we do trauma tension releasing exercise, or TRE. Who is familiar with TRE, trauma releasing exercise? Well, we're going to learn about that. So just to who is familiar with polyvagal theory? All right. So polyvagal theory was created by a few different people. Back Peter Levine, Stephen Porges. Stephen Porges was like kind of credited with it, but he got a lot of help from some of his peers. So to explain this is that when our nervous system is kind of regulated and at homeostasis, most of us are living in this space here. And then when something happens, someone pulls out in front of us, we're having a really bad day at work, we get some really bad news, we'll go up and we'll kind of go, we won't get up here, but we'll go up to frustration, irritated, rage event, and come back down. And that's kind of the natural flow of those emotions. But someone who has high anxiety or PTSD, their baseline is about here. So when they're activated in some way, they have nowhere to go except for up in here. So they're into fight, flight, freeze immediately. And where our cycles, people that are kind of more regulated, our cycle kind of goes through here, cycle up through this area. They're cycling up in here, and they never get down to baseline. So doing things like yoga, mindfulness, TRE, you can actually, it works on the amygdala, and it down-regulates the amygdala. And so with regular use of that, someone who suffers from PTSD or like general anxiety disorder, you can actually move their baseline down permanently. So that is huge and important to know, which is why it is so important for us to incorporate those things that impact that and will let down-regulate the amygdala into our programming. So this is going to explain what TRE is. It's a very short video. This one will work, and hopefully be loud enough.
What is TRE? TRE stands for Tension and Trauma Release Exercises. TRE are exercises that assist the body in releasing deep muscular patterns of stress, tension, and trauma by tremoring. TRE safely activates a natural reflex mechanism of shaking or vibrating that releases muscular tension, which calms down the nervous system and encourages the body to return back to a state of balance, release muscular tension, and consequently calm the nervous system. This might sound overwhelming, but these reflexive tremors are natural, and when activated in a safe and controlled environment, can help the body return to a state of balance. TRE is a series of exercises that simply and safely activates a natural reflex within the body's nervous system to rid stress, ease tension, and ultimately restore equilibrium. You are completely in control of the shaking and can stop anytime you become uncomfortable. If you've ever seen a dog shake during a loud thunderstorm, you've seen muscles releasing stressful energy. This is a natural mechanism that humans have too. The difference is we've been taught to literally hold it in. So what can you expect during a session with Mental Joe? Your certified provider will walk you through some exercises designed to bring your body to state of fatigue, not exhaustion. Think less jazzercise, more Tony Robbins. You'll then lay on the floor and let your body do the work for you for the next 20 minutes or so. Your provider will monitor and check in on you to ensure you're comfortable with the process throughout the entire session. The goal is to prep the physical self to a place where it is ready to literally let go of trauma and tension held deep within the body. TRE provides many of the same benefits as yoga, mental health counseling, and massage. Therefore, it's beneficial for releasing everyday stressors, but it's incredibly beneficial in releasing deep-seated stress like PTSD and other types of trauma held onto in the body in a similar way. We all know the effect stress has on the body and how it makes our muscles ache, teeth clench, blood boil, shoulders tense, and eyes twitch. We all know that the body holds on to stress unless we do something to let it go. In short, TRE is a way to let go.
So, I have another video of actually an Army veteran who you'll see do TRE, but just as an aside, so trauma tension releasing exercise has been around for about 20 years. So David Berceli, who is, again, kind of the same tree, different branches, right, from Peter Levine and Stephen Porges. That whole group are real contemporaries. So same tree, just different branches. And so he actually created TRE. He did a lot of traveling in war-torn areas in the Middle East and South Africa. And he wanted to create something that he could leave behind for the masses, that they could work on their trauma because they don't have access to talk therapy. And there's just so much ongoing trauma with constantly being mortared. And so he realized a couple things. He realized that when he was with a group of people and they got mortared, everyone had the exact response of punching forward and protecting your innards. He also noticed that when there was children, they would shake, but the adults would not. And so he would ask the adults, "Are you not afraid?" And they said, "No, of course we're afraid, but we can't let the children see us shaking." So he got really curious about those two things and created this particular series of exercises. They're really low impact. And with the arrangement of putting yourself in a position on the floor, you can actually initiate that tremor response. So just like we all have that flight, fight, freeze response in us, we have a mechanism to discharge that when we're done using it. But for different reasons, we've overridden that. So complex trauma, where you always have to be on alert, child abuse, domestic violence, combat. Even if you think of your stress and trauma on a continuum, if you're in a stressful situation, maybe you have financial stress going on, and that's happening over a period of time, it starts to look like trauma to your brain and body. So what this does is help discharge that in a way that you can control it and activate it. So next video is also pretty short.
Hi, my name is Arthur Lyon. I am a combat veteran, infantry reconnaissance guy, have about 9 years in the military, so here's my video on how I started shaking on my first TRE workshop, and hopefully this can help you guys. Here I am shaking in my diaphragm. This is the kind of stress I've been holding on to, kind of guarding it.
So this is involuntary. This is your body just reflexively moving.
Shaking, moving into my chest. This is where I've had a lot of pain in my upper thoracic, my upper back. I attribute this to a lot of carrying body armor, rucksacks, jumping out of airplanes, long runs, that fun military stuff. My left arm started shaking, and it took me quite a while to figure out what this was, but I realized every time I would think about an event from overseas, my left arm would always kind of bend up in a reaction to those memories. Tied this to kind of the raising of a rifle and of the same event for a protection or a offensive posture. And many sessions later, I started getting my right arm started kind of like bending up and wanting to go into that same upward movement to get my rifle up. This shaking session was triggered by a memory of a firefight in Baghdad where my unit was pinned down and the citizens around the city were kind of turning on us. And even thought that this wasn't really that big of a deal or wasn't very traumatizing. The shaking really helped me figure out that I really was in actual danger. It was a serious deal, and we, as my whole unit, we're lucky to be here today. And this just really shows that I have all that built-up junk that I never did anything with. And this shaking, the TREs, really helped me overcome the stress and cope with the firefights and the time overseas and all those atrocities that are witnessed in war. And just gave me a kind of a new perspective on a resource or tool that I can use to fix myself and kind of deal with these issues. And I feel like the TREs really made me feel calm, feel like I'm healing myself, and I feel it's like the weight has been lifted off of me, and it seems to be getting better every time I do TREs. Something new comes up, maybe good or bad, but I always feel better at the end of a session, and hopefully the TREs can really help you. So hopefully this has been enlightening, and hopefully this can be a tool for you to use. Thanks.
All right. So just a little FYI, they just finished a 5-year longitudinal study with veterans out of Arizona, and they only use the TRE, and they had like pretty awesome results. They haven't been published yet. They're in the process of publishing them. In a lot of ways, TRE is mirroring EMDR's path, where everyone thought it was really weird at first, and like, I don't really understand why you would do that. But now insurance pays for it, so hopefully it'll be along that same path. Yeah?
So is the memory triggering the shaking?
Actually, no. I'm glad you asked that. So 85% of the time, when you're tremoring, you won't have any memory, you won't have any emotion come up. It's just your body's just doing. A lot of people will just say like, wow, I was just actually able to quiet my mind. Every once in a while a memory might come up, but that's actually not the norm.
So how are they creating this automatic response for people to shake?
So it's the combination of the exercises that are done, which is a little bit lengthy to explain, and then the positioning on the floor to get there. So yeah.
Excuse me, do they have just like baseline tremors as well? Just like normally in their day-to-day?
Nope. No. These are totally like So I could like lay on the floor right now and start tremoring. And the cool thing is like you don't have to, after your body knows what you want it to do and you get it into certain positions on the floor, it's like a muscle memory. So you don't have to go through the series of exercises. Probably with the first 6 times you go through the series of exercises. Yeah. Really awesome. I do it a lot after work. Some days twice a day. Questions? I know there's a lot of information, like really fast. I just want to get it all in there. So, yeah.
In terms of your treatment, how much is spent individually with the client and in the milieu or in group?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We have 3 psychotherapy groups a day on Monday through Friday, 2 on the weekends. And then on this unit, we spend pretty extensive time one-on-one. When I'm doing trauma with a patient, the trauma session is generally anywhere from a half hour to an hour and 15 minutes. Otherwise, when I'm checking in with them, I check in daily, and that can be 15 minutes to 45 minutes depending on the day. Usually I try to structure it and let them know like I'll have 3 longer check-ins a week and then a shorter check-in on 2 days. Yeah, and then in the milieu they're pretty heavily scheduled actually. When they're not in psychotherapy, they have yoga, they have like music therapy or art therapy, so it's a pretty structured day.
How long is the average length of stay compared to, let's say, the other programs?
Right, so longer. The active duty often will come in for a 28-day program. And depending on the amount of trauma or the amount of the need, this is where it gets tricky. So we can work with the military and get it extended up to a couple weeks. Not with the Army, though. With the Army, they're like 28 days, that's all you get. You better figure it out. And then with veterans, it's a little bit different. We worked very closely with the VA, and we get a lot of their overflow. And veterans because they have so much of their programming at the VA, we wouldn't get like a 28-day program there. However, we still do a lot of trauma work with them. It's just tailored a little more swiftly. We might not do all of the CPT steps, but we will address their trauma needs and get them kind of squared away before they leave. And then with first responders, it's a little frustrating because of insurance companies. So first responders, so a veteran's average stay is probably 7 days to like 14 to 18 days, depending on the situation and the need. First responders are generally 7 days to 14 days. On a rare occasion with like extreme suicidality, we can get a little more time. But that's kind of generally what they look. But they're all, regardless of how long they're there, they always are. Everyone is going to start out with a schema thing, and everyone is going to go right into trauma inventory, which is important because I always tell them, like, when you go to your outside therapy, bring this with you. And so you can talk about that, and it will already be organized, and you will have a jumping off spot.
How long was your training to go through the exercises to learn those?
The theory, it's about a year. Yeah.
So then when you're working with a client, like, how many sessions on the average does it take for them to get to that point to be able?
One. I do it every week with new people every week. Yeah. So once a week that we do theory on the unit. I do it with the unit. And I suggest that if they feel comfortable, they continue to practice throughout the week.
So it could be like a lifetime of that. So for anyone, even a baby coming through, like, could be trauma, right?
Yeah.
So if you just have people that haven't had like much trauma, it still is a good way to release.
Everything's, think about watching the news these days.
Right.
I mean, we all have stress and,
Right.
yeah. If you can call me and I can tell you more about it. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
The intake process
It's a little faster. We recently moved to people that are going to go on to the Heroes unit, going directly back to the unit and not having to be in the intake process for hours before getting back there.
And has your intake process in the front part changed? Because I know the last time that I brought something in, it was like 3.5 hours.
Yeah, you can speak better to that. That's not my zone, so I'm not going to speak to that.
The process takes, in a perfect world, will take, anywhere from that hour and a half to 2 hours. But really, how busy we are at that time. So I can't recall, or maybe the time that you would come, but I would imagine it might have been a little busier. And that is both with our assessment, because they're the ones taking the phone calls as well, and then they're also going to be the ones doing that level of care assessment. So it really depends on what we're looking like at that time, because of all of our 10 assessment rooms, sometimes we have 2 assessments going on, and then that's typically where it's going to take that hour and a half. But then it gets up to lengthier when we do have those 10 assessment rooms full, and we have staff running back and forth checking on to make sure that each client or each patient is okay, things like that. And then just also with the whole questionnaires that we do, and then the benefits and all that stuff. So anytime that there's more people coming in through our doors, it's going to be a little bit longer. But we are trying to alleviate that. We've made some internal changes to try to make it quicker. Yeah?
I recently sent you guys a referral for your hearing unit. I'm just curious as to why in that level of care you guys allow them just on that unit to have their cell phones.
I can answer that. We allow them to have their cell phones because it is a privileged unit, and because they're there for 28 days, they have to do banking. Their families are all over the place. And family support, we believe, is pretty important to the recovery process. They're doing video chats with their children. They're reaching out to people that are in different parts of the country. We do allow them, we have generally 2 talk times a day.
I was just going to ask, like this in particular, patient was calling me from his cell phone all day, like every day.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if that was like monitored.
Yep. There's specific talk times, and it's a specific place. On occasion, for example, we had a patient whose father passed away yesterday. That patient has access to their phone more readily because obviously they need to be planning and organizing for that. Yeah, but it is monitored and it is specific times throughout the day. So if they were calling you all day long,
I got his therapist involved, so
yeah.
it was worth happening.
Other questions?
Any other questions? Well, hey, thank you guys so
All right,
much.
thank you. Thanks for your time.
Keep anybody too long.
I know. Sorry about the technical difficulties.
Please take